Hello, Old School Comics Review. Okay, today we're going to look at Blazing Combat. What I have here is the softcover trade paperback edition put out by Fantagraphics Comics, which reprints all four issues of the Blazing Combat series that came out in the mid '60s. That was originally published by Warren Publishing. It was basically a black and white magazine-sized war anthology comic. It was put out by Warren Publishing, which at the time they had done the Creepy magazine and Eerie and a few other things. And basically, those comics kind of took off, and they were like, well, just explain. Excuse me. Sorry, still have this messed up cough. Basically, they had put out Creepy and Eerie and, these horror magazines and things like that. And those were kind of influenced, kind of like a throwback, kind of influenced by the EC horror comics like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror and those type of things and Weird Science and whatnot. And I guess they had a success with that, so Warren was like, what else can we do? Well, let's do a war comic. And they did a war comic kind of in the vein of the war comics that came out from EC during the 50s. At the same time, stuff like Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat. And the thing is, those war comics were a little bit different than the other war comics that came out. Back then, the majority of war comics were kind of like, the big the big super macho, here's the Sarge, and he's got a cigar in his hand, and his shirt's all ripped open, and he's got, he's taking down the Nazis and the Japs with his one hand and his rifle, and he's taking them all down by himself, and blah, blah, blah. Whereas, Two-Fisted Tales and things like that, and Frontline Combat were a little bit grittier, and the emphasis was always on like the infantryman, the grunt, the regular guy, and they usually kind of had this kind of like, war is hell type of twist to it, So, I don't know if I want to say they were totally realistic, but in contrast, they were a lot more realistic than, some of the other things that were coming out at the time and even afterwards. And like I said, Blazing Combat from Warren Publishing was kind of like a throwback to those stories that were originally done by Harvey Kurtzman and thing. I've read some of them. I haven't read all of them. I actually really want to get some more of like that 50s stuff. But but anyway, talking about this stuff, most of the stories, the comic was edited by Archie Goodwin, and he wrote like all the stories here. And the thing is, it was the comic was kind of cut short. It was canceled a little bit before its time because there was a slight controversy because I believe somebody from some military base got a hold of it and was like didn't like one of the stories in it and said, "Oh, we're not going to sell this on any military bases or whatever." And word got kind of around, and then people were like, "Oh," some people were like, "Oh, this is that anti-American comic book," and so on and so forth, and that kind of frightened some of like the distributors and wholesalers or whatever, so they wouldn't even like send it out to like the newsstands and things like that. So you had like stacks of these comics just kind of like sitting in a warehouse somewhere, and it wasn't like, the comics were out there and the public didn't like them or the readers didn't like them. It's just like, some people from wherever said something and made other people upset and made other people, I should say, nervous and so on and so forth. Because if you read these stories, there's really nothing anti-American about them. They definitely are not anti-military, and they're definitely not anti-troop. You know what? I'll kind of admit this. I kind of heard about this comic before I ever read any of these stories, so I kind of like got it thinking like, oh man, these are going to be these hard-hitting stories. Oh, this is going to be so edgy and whatever. And in a way, they really aren't. You can't say that The stories, they kind of take that different twist again. They kind of take that, the tragedy of war, the futility of war. War is hell. We send our brave young our brave young men out there to fight and for what, type of thing. But there's nothing you could characterized in any of these stories as being either anti-military or anti-American. Jim Warren was in the service. Archie Goodwin was in the army. I don't think he I don't think he ever saw any combat. I think he did like clerical work or something like that. And as a fact, in the back of my edition, it's got a couple of interviews with both Jim Warren and Archie Goodwin or whatever. And plus, the art is by these like old '50s guys. Who had been veterans in the business for like years. I really don't think they would have signed on, not knowing any of them personally, but I kind of doubt these guys would have signed on to something that they thought was like commie liberal propaganda or whatever. It's not like this is like some, underground comics like, whatever, Robert Crumb or the Freak Brothers or something like that. These are pretty solid, just solid war stories. That's what it is. So there. Talking about the actual stories, I gotta admit, I was slightly disappointed. You know what I mean? I know Archie Goodwin was editing. He did all the editing here. He wrote all the stories. I know he's also doing Creepy magazine and Eerie and some other things. And I don't know. There's some really good stories here, but I hate to say it, I kind of feel as far as the stories as the writing, the mediocre stuff kind of outnumbers like the good stuff. But some of the stories I like though. I like the story Enemy. I like the story Landscape. That's actually the story that that was kind of controversial. It's set in Vietnam and some Vietnamese innocent Vietnamese farmer gets killed at the end. I gave it away, but that's kind of like, I'm sure that's what kind of made somebody think like, oh no, this isn't rah rah rah, this is sad, But anyway, the Enemy is good, Landscape is good, Saratoga is good. I like Survival, I like Souvenirs, I like Conflict. There's a story called Give and Take that I like a lot. And the stories, like I said, it's back to the whole idea of, war is hell, the futility of the futility and the tragedy of, nationalistic violence. It's not even nationalistic violence, but just, the tragedy of war. Why must we send our men out there to fight against their brothers type of thing? And, one story in here was called Special Forces. There's this whole thing where a couple of troop of Special Forces guys, they're in the brush or whatever, they get ambushed, and it's a bloody fight, and it's tragic, and it's this and it's that, and they're ambushed again, and there's booby traps and blah blah blah. And at the end of the story, it's just the two guys are left standing, and one guy says to the other, we made it out alive. And then the other guy says, yeah, but there's one thing that bothers me. What's that? And the lead guy lights up a cigarette. He looks thoughtfully, he goes, there's always tomorrow. Like, oh, we made it through these hellhole, but we just gotta do it again tomorrow. That sort of thing. That's kind of like the twist on a lot of stories. But like I said, some of the other stories that are a little bit more, I guess, insightful or hit at bigger themes. There's some stuff about. There's a story about racism. There's a story about how during the Civil War, there might have been some Union soldiers who were a little bit more interested in pillaging than they were in actually fighting for the cause they were literally fighting for. There's a story about how starvation and poverty drives men to animalistic methods and whatnot. So like I said, it's some interesting things here. There are some good stories here. Oh, there's one story about the 300 Spartans, which is actually the same story that Frank Miller got his inspiration for, 300 and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's kind of my view of the stories. There's few really good stories. A lot of them are just kind of you know what I mean. But having said that, I would still recommend this. I would recommend this just on the art alone, because I think personally, I think all the art here is marvelous. Like I said, you've got guys who are industry veterans here. You've got people who did work for EC back in the '60s or back in the '50s, and all of it's good. It's in black and white, but color wouldn't add to it at all. It works in black and white, the way that some of the artists use, the dark against the light, the dark, uh, dark. I'm repeating myself, but the blacks against the whites, that contrast. Other artists really work the idea of using midtones and washes and grays and variations in the shading. You've got some marvelous like cross hatching by like Reed Crandall and stuff like that. So it's really, really great. I mean, if you have any interest in graphics or comic book art or Silver Age art, or even just looking at a different type of art, a different type of storytelling, if you're just used to like modern superhero art, all this stuff is really great. Some of the guys here are like Joe Orlando, who's been around forever, Angelo Torres, Gray Morrow, who's really revered, Reed Crandall, I think I mentioned, John Severin, who's really been around, who's really great, who's really revered. Alex Toth, another guy. Who else is here? Gene Colan is in here. Wally Wood is in here. So really, even if you don't like war stories, if you don't like, the actual writing here, just pick it up. Pick it up for the art alone, because it's really, really, really great. I can't say enough about the art. I'm going to try to put some examples of some of the art here if I can. So that's about it. Like I said, I don't think this holds up as well as those 50s stories by Harvey Kurtzman. That Two-Fisted Tales, that Frontline Combat stuff, and that stuff I kind of want to like seek out a little bit more. But I know where I can get it. But I want to see if I can find it a little bit cheaper. You know what I mean? Because hey, it's still a recession. So anyway, there. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you've got any war comic recommendations you want to make. Tell me if you've ever read any of these stories. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you agree with me. Tell me you think I'm full of crap. And that's it. Oh, and check out my blog and leave comments there. Leave comments here. Once again, I got to thank you very much for listening, and you have a great day.